apart here, I've written up some what I would call major social change processes. Now what I mean by this is that these are processes identified, especially in the 20th century, by social scientists, historians, and other writers as ways to try and describe what seemed like broad trends that were happening. Now, as I mentioned in the first part of the lecture, though, one problem with doing so in trying to describe broad trends is not only that you miss nuance, but you actually may be thinking that you've caught some sort of internally consistent linear process that must happen versus actually catching a process that is happening but can change in the future and happens for a variety of reasons. So some of the big major change processes that sociologists have talked about and how this affects cultures. For a long time, sociologists have talked about this idea of secularization, that somehow religion is and must be decreasing over time. There's a whole lot of debate about that, but the main conclusion here is, as a process, a linear change process that must be happening, it's not true. Another argument in the mid-20th century was modernization theory, was that new kind of technologies and education and things like this would cause, or really new economic forces in countries would lead to, quote, developing countries that would become, quote, developed, that they would all, just given enough time, look like the United States. Well, that hasn't happened either, for a whole host of both political and economic and cultural reasons. Another idea right at the end of the 1980s, a popular idea, was the end of history idea. In other words, that capitalist freedom was on the march, that global markets would spread, that democracies would flourish, and on and on. That also hasn't happened. And then finally, we have another argument, which we see in our reading for this work, which is that convergence will happen, that somehow as globalization, which means the interconnectedness of society through flows of information, trade, and persons, that somehow as globalization increases, that convergence in global culture will happen. In other words, in a popular phrase, we'll all be victims of McDonaldization, and that indigenous as well as long-rooted cultures in various parts of the world will just fall apart. Well, we know these first three didn't end up being true. What about this third one? Norris takes us on a tour of this final one. And his basic argument is, as globalization, or really as cosmopolitanism, goes up, so within a country, as cosmopolitanism goes up, is it true that all countries also have the same cultural shifts? So this is a line of thought that Norris and his co-author are responding to. They want to know, as cosmopolitanism goes up, which is really kind of a measure of globalization, and he talks about it in his article, how they make this measure. Oh, by the way, this is from the World Values Survey, if you didn't catch that in my reading notes, which we've heard about before. So he's looking at different countries, different societies over time throughout the world. As their amount of cosmopolitanism goes up, is it true that their culture shifts? And the theory of convergence here is that this process, if it's occurring, will make it so that all societies become the same, basically. That cultural convergence will occur through this process of globalization and cosmopolitanism. Well, I encourage you to look closely at the charts that he shows because they show some interesting things. They should immediately make you think of Robert Withnow's way of looking at the complexity of change, both endogenous and exogenous change. And Norris shows a couple of things. One, overall religiosity it continues to be low in very cosmopolitan countries, except for the United States. The United States always being this outlier of having both high religiosity levels and really high cosmopolitan levels. But then he also shows that they're in some of what he calls these parochial countries, they've had some increases in cosmopolitanism, but not big downfalls in religiosity. So showing complexity right off the bat here. Overall, he shows there are some trends in cosmopolitanism, so that as countries become more cosmopolitan, they may become a little less religious, they may become less nationalistic, and they may become more sexually liberal, but this doesn't have to happen, and it's not a linear process as we've been talking about. What seems to really be happening is that he splits countries into two groups. One I think he calls cosmopolitan societies, and the other he calls parochial. Now the idea should be, the theory should say, that over time, so time being this way, as time goes on, the culture, these countries should basically converge. Really the argument is that with cosmopolitanism over time, parochial countries will basically approach rich countries. So that's the theoretical argument, that these two trend lines will occur. What he's found instead basically is that there's it's kind of a jagged line, and these kind of richer cosmopolitan countries already continue to kind of pull away from parochial countries. So there may be some trend line for both of these groups, but there's no convergence. So it's possible, given enough time, these countries may reach these points of kind of low religiosity, high liberal sexuality, low nationalism. But as he makes sure to point out, there's both huge differences between these country groupings, and within countries there's huge differences. So even within these cosmopolitan countries like the United States, there's huge heterogeneity on attitudes about sexuality, attitudes about nationalism, even attitudes about religion. And so their point is that there's no kind of necessary coherency even within these national societies, and that certainly there's no convergence happening over time, and that even more so, there seem to be plenty of reasons to think that there are breaks or barriers on convergence. And otherwise, what he's saying is that there are conditions, there are causes by which that linearity that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture does not necessarily happen. And some of those breaks or buffers are things like long cultural history. So it seems to be the case that a long cultural history in the United States of having religion-state separation, so both active democracy and active religion, will prevent, as cosmopolitanism increases, will prevent religiosity from just falling off. There seems to be buffers also in terms of how isolated societies are. So some societies can be quite isolated. Really, if you think about it, China, Iran are isolated in terms of their political and military ideologies, but they have tons of technological advancement and have still retained kind of a high levels of religiosity in the case of Iran, or nationalism in the case of China, as well as rather kind of non-liberal sexual moralities. So the point here is that there's a whole heck of a lot of complexity. There's no necessary trend line within the United States or even within the globe as a whole as to what's going to happen in terms of any sort of cultural convergence. Instead, there's a lot of static. The lines jump up and down a lot. And our kind of challenge as sociologists, and more importantly for our class as kind of informed both citizens and humans, is to not go for these simple answers, to be skeptical of big claims about long trends that must necessarily happen, and to realize that in the midst of it all, there's really important sociological processes that are always ongoing, exogenous as well as endogenous, so that the last decade of the United States history, for example, nobody would have predicted in 1999 or even 2000 that what we've had. So just even being able to look back a little bit and to see that where we are and where the world is not any sort of natural linear trend, is an important skill to cultivate in your own life, in your own thinking. Let me end there. It's been a really terrific course. I've said quite a lot in this lecture, but more so I want you to walk away with some kind of broad ways of thinking. I hope as you go forward, some of what we've learned in this class inspires you to think differently, to teach differently, to learn differently, to read differently, and to be informed about the complexity of culture, but as well as how important it is to think about these cultural dynamics we've learned about in our lives as Americans, but also as global citizens. So best of luck to you, and have a great summer.